A very good evening to all of you, and welcome to the discussion of Here and Thereafter.
Hereafter.
Yeah, Here and Hereafter. There and Hereafter. Um, we have the author with us, Vineet Gill, and it's a special occasion because he lives in Delhi and was in Goa, and we were able to invite him. So, thank you, Vineet, for being here. And I would also like to thank Leo and his wife Queenie for hosting us at DogEars Bookshop. It's a very special bookshop because it's the first bookshop of its kind in South Goa. South Goa is known as cowboy territory. You had a lot of politicians who started around like cowboys. Now, of course, they are all sheep in wolf's clothing. But South is very different from North Goa, and people are sedate like all Souths. Um, Reading habits are not so strong as in the North. But anyway, this is a book which is unputdownable and a must read for everyone. Teachers in colleges who teach languages, Hindi, English, because not only is it a kind of biography of Vineet Gill's, I'm so sorry, of Nirmal Verma, but it is also captures the history of the nation. Lots of things that have happened. Hindi, as you know, is a young language. So it captures the history of the nation, important developments in literature, so on and so forth. And it's so lucidly written that it's a pleasure to read. It's just, a hundred and some pages, but every page is loaded with meaning, loaded with material that you can ruminate on and think about. So, writers who have commented on the book, on the jacket of the book, have really come out lucidly as well. It says it creates a balance between the author, work, and age. It brings out patterns of thoughts and symmetries of experience, younger and older writers and the young biographer. Brings out the imbricated world of Hindu and international literature. Yet, Vineet, you say it's a book about reading. Please take us on this writing journey and tell us more about how you zoomed in on Nirmal Verma and what makes this book special for you and for us.
Yeah, thanks, Savia. First of all, for your very kind words about my book. Thanks for reading it also, and for hosting us here today. It's a wonderful part of Goa, my first time here, and it's a great bookshop. I've already found 3 old books that I'm buying. So, uh, so thanks. Yeah. So to begin with, this is a book about reading. Yeah, I wanted to sort of right at the outset make it clear that this is not a biography. That this doesn't sort of delve into the details of the writer's life too much, although I do that intermittently. So once I decided that it was not going to be a biography, I had to take a call on the kind of book it was going to be. And the other options available in front of me, there were, of course, there were no alternatives when I started out, because when you start thinking about writing a book centered on a writer's life and work, the biography sort of comes into your head by default. That's set template, and we have to follow it. We have to use it. So I was very clear that I was not going to do that because biographies generally kind of bore me as a reader. And the other thing I didn't want to do was to make it an academic book of criticism, because they bore me as well. So I want to write, the kind of book I like to read. And so I had to write this, and I had to sort of think about this book in the quote unquote common reader mode. The term common reader comes from Virginia Woolf, who wrote 2 great collections of literary essays and reviews, um, distancing herself from academic criticism of all kind, and addressing the common reader and writing as a common reader herself. You know, so yeah, so that's why I thought at the, I declared in the introduction to the book that that this book is that I'm writing this book as a reader and as a non-expert. Second thing is here that I should mention is that this book is also about a very committed and imaginative reader. Now, Nirmal Verma was a lifelong reader, of course. He sort of supplied his reading supplied ideas into his writing. You know, he 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 didn't he never wrote in a kind of a cultural vacuum as writers today, especially novelists today in India, writing in the English language tend to do. You know, not all of them, but I see that tendency. So he was always in dialogue with other writers through his critical essays, through his travel writings, through his stories, and through his novels. You know, he's always addressing some writer or borrowing something from the people he was reading regularly. And so yeah, I thought reading would be a good theme for this book.
Excellent.
Yeah.
The book begins on October 25th, 2005.
Yeah.
Right? We'll come to the Bloomsbury group later on, though I'd love to jump at that,
Yeah.
and Virginia Woolf. But it starts in the ICU at Delhi Institute of Medical Sciences. The topography beautifully recaptured: pills, ointment, thermos, chamber pot, and a little note that Verma at some point of time passes on to his brother Ram Kumar.
Kumar.
Am
Yeah.
I dying? Was Nirmal Verma obsessed with death, both in life as well as in his writing?
Yeah, that's my reading of his work. I mean, to obsess sounds like a very strong term, but um, you know, as a writer, he found some kind of creative spark in the idea of mortality. In the, you know, he used it um, he used it as a maybe a substitute for spirituality of some kind. As a lot of writers that I mentioned in my first chapter about Verma's last day did too. You know, it was um, death became a substitute for God, for instance, for writers, for a lot of for writers like Dostoevsky. You know, there's this constant tension between the religious and the secular in these writers, and in our time, when the secular forces seem to have won, I see that kind of anxiety in writers who feel that something might be missing, you know, something might be missing in their philosophical sort of worldview, and they complete it by um, looking at mortality very seriously and imaginatively. Lots of creative artists have done that, musicians, painters, and writers. So Verma was one of them. So I mean, I wouldn't say that he was constantly thinking about all his books are about, you know, all that dismal stuff. No, he, his writing is very life affirming. But there is always this undertow of this this awareness that all this is impermanent. So yeah, so it's very um, you know, it's very humbling to read him for that reason also.
I love the way you create his journey as a writer. You know, the first um, little episode, Vineet, that you give us of how he's playing football as a child. And suddenly, you know, he's transfixed by the sun and
Yeah.
he just gets into nature. Then you take us on this journey of how Tagore's Gitanjali, Hindu scriptures, his experiences at the Dal Lake, Russian writers, his brief forays into CPI and the writers of the Bloomsbury group. especially Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
Why did he choose? This is one thing. Secondly, I'd also like you to talk about why he chose to write in Hindi.
Yeah.
Which is,
Yeah. It was, yeah.
I mean,
It's kind of a
cross section of influences.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, to begin with, we started talking about the making of the writer Nirmal. And it begins with a moment of noticing. Suddenly, I mean, he'd seen many sunsets, I'm sure, out of the corner of his eye, or barely consciously, as we all do. Even when we are focused on the sunset, we're not really noticing it. At the beach, for instance. But there was this moment of noticing that happened in his life in Shimla during a football game. He was very young, and then it was a different kind of noticing, obviously, and it triggered um, the triggered Verma's literary imagination at a young age. Now, what it means, I think, I mean, he doesn't go into it in that particular essay that I quote from. What he did after that noticing, I mean, obviously he was remembering that moment at a very later stage of his life, right? But I think what he meant was noticing the sunset and then feeling feeling something inside that told him, hearing a voice inside that told him that I must capture it somehow. I must write about it. I must record this. That's what noticing means in the context of art. You know, an artist, when he or she notices, they want to capture it also. So that was the moment. And then you talk about his evolution as a political thinker and a literary thinker. And then, of course, the significant choice he made in choosing his language. Now, Verma was he was born in Shimla. He came to Delhi quite early on in his life, and he had an upper middle class existence in Delhi. He had an English medium education as well. He went to the Delhi University, did an MA in history. And he was he could well have sort of chosen to write in English. He was very fluent in that language, of course, both as a speaker and as a writer. And most of his reading was in English throughout his life. Most of it was happening in English. And now this wasn't a unique case when you look at the world of Hindi. And this was a discovery for me because I was so disconnected from this setting, even though I was right in the middle of it. I was in Delhi, and Hindi was my main language, etc. So he chose. I think it was also a political choice because during that time, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of serious intellectuals were shunning English. Creative writers who, although they were doing a lot of their writing in English, but when it came to their creative work, they would always veer towards their mother tongue. Now, a great example is Tagore, who only wrote his social essays in English. Everything else, his poetry, novels, stories, etc., was in Bengali. Bankim Chand Chattopadhyay did the same thing. So there was this a set approach, obviously. So the examples were before Verma already in Bengali and as well as in other languages. So this of course may have been a kind of a colonial, the choice of a colonial subject, but also it wasn't in Verma's case. In the case of a lot of other Hindi and Bengali writers. I'm thinking of Buddhadev Bose, who wrote in Bengali as well as in English. There was no bitterness towards the English language. In fact, they had a great feeling and sensitivity towards the English language. These writers who were educating themselves in English as well as in other languages. So for Verma, there's a great scene in one of his stories where one of the characters asks the protagonist, "Why don't you write in English? Why do you write in Hindi?" So the question that Verma was asked often, and the protagonist says, "I never thought about it. It just comes to me naturally." So he chose it as a painter chooses his medium.
And
You know,
probably for him, it was a language of his emotions, a
he
language
said
of
that.
interiority.
He
Yeah.
said that. He said as much. You know, that when it comes to imagining the
Yeah.
world, when it comes to thinking like creative writer,
Yeah.
I just go to Hindi. He said that, but he did a lot of critical writing in Hindi as well. He wrote reportage, travel writing as well in Hindi.
In Hindi.
But yeah, I think there came a point when I think the language chooses you rather than you choosing
You
language.
choose it. Um, Earlier, Premchand wrote rural stories, but Verma said very clearly that I've spent my life in cities. The rural life is not a part of my sensibility. And this is a very interesting quote. I'm taking everything from your book at short notice. A city without ruins is like a man without memories. So tell us more about his life in Delhi. He spent the time of the partition in Delhi, right? He was with the CPI at that time.
Yeah,
And he went through the throes of partition, reaching
Absolutely.
people to the railway stations,
Mhm.
clearing up dead bodies. And you describe this horrific image that has stayed in my mind, which is in your book. He says
Yeah.
he saw an arm that was swollen with pus, but with all jewelry in it. But it never comes in his literature. Why did he shun the partition in his literature?
It's very difficult to surmise that now, but of course, I offer a theory in my book, which is that because a lot of his contemporaries were writing about partition, almost felt obligated to write about partition, and there were a lot of creative choices that a writer makes that have to do with rejection rather than acceptance and assimilation. You know, there is that, but also you need to decide what you don't want to do. You know, so Verma decided at some point, I suppose, consciously or otherwise, that the subject didn't appeal to him as a writer, and it was okay because um, one might have felt around that time called upon to to deliver a partition novel. If you're a novelist, if you're a storyteller, why don't you tackle the most important theme of your time? So a writer equally has the right to say, no, I don't want to do that. So I guess Verma did that, and it wasn't for any lack of experience on his part, as you just said. Yeah, he worked quite actively on the streets, providing um, support to the people who were to the great exodus from Delhi all the way to Pakistan. He and providing relief and help to the exodus coming from the other side to Delhi. You know, in one of his um, one such trip in Old Delhi, he just after a very bloody riot in that part of town, there were several such riots in 1947. He his job is clearing dead bodies from houses, and at one point he just looks at a severed arm of a woman with jewelry with some bangles, etc. So still on the arm, and yeah, it was a striking image. It was an unforgettable image for me when I read it in one of his interviews, and I thought as a writer I would be shocked when I saw it if I were to see something like that, but I'd also instantly become in a very opportunistic way. I would start thinking about, okay, how do I make use of that image? But I think it it shows us how mature writer Verma was even at that young an age, choosing to
Not
sort of
cash in
discard
on
that, yeah, and not just that, but a lot of other I'm sure very very moving experiences, shocking experiences that he had in Prague, etc. Um, very what we get in his fiction and his writing is sort of a refined version of the very raw experiences that he had as a writer, and that kind of refinement, that explains his creative process, how experience is translated into art. You see that in Verma when you compare his letters and diaries and interviews to his fiction and other books.
Tell us more about his decade in Prague.
Yeah.
He comes back at the time of the spring of 1968.
Yeah.
Right? But he wasn't asked to go, but
Yeah,
the time had come for him.
he
to
just
leave.
went because he had nothing in Delhi. He was, he was jobless for the longest time. He wasn't able to earn any money. He was broke most of the time.
Tuitions, I think.
Yeah, they were trying to make some, small odd jobs here and there, trying to teach people English, writing for friends and etc. There was nothing to do in Delhi in the 50s. There were a lot of jobless people, and Verma's one of Verma's recurring themes in his early stories is joblessness. And it was because of that joblessness that he actually became a writer. And a lot of people became great artists. And his brother Ram Kumar, one of the greatest modern painters India ever produced. Ram Kumar was his elder brother, who was himself equally jobless, but he just struck lucky at one point, took some loan from his father, went to France to study painting, and people started taking him seriously, and he was surprised. And he happened to land up in Prague, had an exhibition, and sort of arranged the passage for his younger brother, Varma. And Ramkumar said that nothing was working out for him. He was just becoming very, very sad. So something had to be done. It was pure accident that Verma suddenly found himself in Prague on a translation fellowship. Now that was also a different Europe. Today's Europe is kind of very self-contained and inward-looking. Back then, it was opening up. Even behind the Iron Curtain, there was a lot of space for other cultures, and Verma was a beneficiary of that kind of phase in European history, short-lived phase. So was Ramkumar. So there was an institute called the Oriental Institute, and they were looking for translators who would translate modern Czech writings into Hindi. It's a strange kind of an ambition, right? Even on their part. But they said, we'll pay to anyone who comes here. And he doesn't have to know the language as well. So we will teach you the language. That's the Europe I'm talking about. It can't happen today. Sure. So they got Verma to Prague, paid for his stay, etc., taught him, made him sort of go through a language course for a year or two, and then asked him to just start translating stuff. So Verma was here from 1959 to 1968. And Verma was in Prague.
Almost 9 years.
9 years exactly. And 68 was, of course, a very significant year in the history of Central Europe. Certainly in the history of that particular city. It was right when Prague Spring was at its peak. Verma was writing letters to his brother Ram Kumar, reporting about Prague and saying that maybe communism has a future after all. Verma had ceased to be a communist in 1956.
He was a card holder at one point.
He returned. He cancelled his membership in 1956, Hungary, when the Soviets went to Hungary. And that was quite early for him. He could see through that ideology very early on in his life. And it was it's rare to come across that.
A young person kind of.
Yeah, even George Orwell couldn't, what was Orwell's? No, I'm saying that I think apart from Orwell, there aren't many British thinkers even who could really see through the left as well as the right. Very early.
Wonderful film, Mr. Jones. I don't know if you've seen
it.
It looks at Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine, and there's this Mr. Jones, who's a government servant who travels to Ukraine. And sees
what's happening. That happened to a lot of people. Lot of British writers also went to Russia and so on, to see what was happening, and some of them turned a blind eye to a lot of um,
Yeah, they were enamored.
misery and enamored of a kind of a completely sort of engineered tour. They were taken through sanitized paths, but some were lucky enough to even catch glimpses of the real wretchedness of what was happening there.
Of the farmers in Ukraine, actually.
Yeah.
The destruction of
Right.
farms.
Varma did too.
Yeah.
So
after the spring of 68, he comes to London, and then 73 he relocates to India.
Yeah.
Okay. So he comes to Delhi and is disillusioned totally. There's a lack of an intellectual class, which your book tells us, which he finds extreme wealth and inhuman poverty. That is a thing that comes through literature, but also through journalism at that point of time. And the ideas kind of look at the two Indias and create a kind of consciousness in several writings. But he's one of the proponents of that entire, stark picture of wealth and poverty in India.
Yeah, although he sort of doesn't deal with it directly in his fiction, but he's among the first people to notice it and to attack it very early on. 70s, he's talking about, he's basically warning us that what's coming, this wave of commercialization is going to drown everything. Will be inundated. And this is very early on, and that was a Delhi. That wasn't actually what it became in say 2000, when I was growing up. Then the transformation was complete. But back then there were still pockets where cultural life was taking place. Delhi, there was this kind of rampant mainstreaming of culture and institutions and politics, but there was still room for alternative voices.
Yeah, there were alternative voices, the most important thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is what is.
And so the margins were still allowed to exist, in that decade, and even in the decades following that, 80s and 90s, and around the 90s. I mean, post-liberalization, that's when it completely, there was no question to be asked. So the margins are completely erased, and it became a monoculture powered by money, and it became sort of a very self-aware, self-conscious kind of power capital, power center of India, where the focus shifted entirely from the places where people were living, where life is happening, to this administrative sort of dream township called New Delhi. Nobody talked about New Delhi, I think, before the 90s. It was, I mean, obviously it was spoken of in an ironic way, because nobody lived there and nobody cared about that. Because right now, it's become the city, and Delhi, the real place, has become a kind of a suburb. It's a strange kind of marginalization, and it's not just marginalization. The life outside New Delhi has been pushed out, literally outside the borders. So we have a new kind of townships and conglomerates coming up like Noida and Gurgaon, etc. So it's a sad kind of transformation that has happened. But yeah, it's good to remember that there was a time when such work was possible. People were.
And there was a strong culture where you could look at.
Yeah, there was space for all sorts of interesting experiments, and those experiments could have been political in nature. I mean, not just artistic. Lots of painters came to Delhi and made it their home. In fact, a lot of them lived all their life, like Raza, whose paintings you have here, Krishan Khanna, etc. Lots of poets, but it was never a kind of
political activists.
Yeah, but it was never. Delhi was never that this kind of solitary kind of center, nerve center.
It was a hub.
It became. It was a hub. For Hindi, it was Banaras. Banaras was possibly bigger than Delhi when it came to Hindi publishing. Allahabad, much bigger. The two main publishers, Rajkamal, Vani, they came from, I think, Allahabad. So Delhi was coming into its own,
Yeah.
and of course that helped because it was a kind of a blank slate for a lot of people. It was a city still half built,
Yeah.
half formed, and so there was a lot of potential. There was that. So although I never could, of course, I never witnessed all that, but when I read about it, I feel nostalgic
Yeah,
for that
for that.
for that period. Also, the great tragedy of Delhi is not what it's become, because all cities are now like Delhi. I mean, if you take out the sea in
Bombay.
Goa,
Yeah.
that's same. That's the same thing.
Yes,
know.
absolutely.
So I see Delhi wherever I go. But the problem is that Delhi is very keen on forgetting its past. There are no books written about that particular phase in Delhi's life.
Which is so rich.
Yeah, a lot of you'll find a lot of books
Yeah.
on the Sultanate, etc., the
Yeah.
Mughal past,
Yeah, the
etc.
past, yeah.
But the 50s, recent
Yeah,
history,
yeah.
that is completely snuffed out.
Okay, I love this word that you use, gumakad, and I prefer it to flaneur because flaneur is very city located. You talk about the two different modes of writing and reportage that Verma takes to.
Yeah.
And he says he could switch between them, but it was the conflict that shaped his travel narratives, conflict between the two, writing and the reportage. Tell us also a little bit more about the cities that you traveled to. Reykjavik, you say, in Iceland. Let's say a bit about Prague, some memories we can capture for it. Because I'll tell you very frankly, we are, caught in a strange bind. It's an ex-Portuguese colony with a mental block towards Northern Goa and Hindi. You see? So, except in your school textbooks or college literature, you will not hear people talking of Hindi writers as you would find talk about Western writers. But we want to break this bias, because I think your book is so rich in its layering of a writer's understanding of India, a writer's understanding of where we need to go as a nation or as people, taking our language, taking our history, taking our emotions with us as Indians. And you will also find that conflict in him. He may be a liberal, but at the same time, he makes certain choices which leave you very flabbergasted. If you had a liberal upbringing and liberal exposure in college time, you wonder, why did you go for it? I'm nearing that age when I should be thinking of mortality. And I say, why did he make a choice of that? If I die, I want to be burned near the ocean. Why did he go for rituals which he rejected all his life? We'll come to that later, but let's talk to about his travel writing first.
Yeah, as a travel writer, there is no real tradition of travel writing in Hindi. There is a writer, famous writer called Rahul Sanktai, who wrote some travel books, and I'm sure inspired by the British and the Europeans. It's a very European form, the missionaries would write books and the explorers, etc. So I don't know, the colonial subject was very embarrassed when it came to travel writing. It's almost like conquest. You go somewhere and write a book. But
Parsis did it. I must say the Parsis did it.
Yeah.
There were a lot of Parsi cyclists who went all over the world.
I see.
And wrote these travel writings, which are fascinating, but as you rightly said, very much influenced by the British.
By the British, yeah. But so what Verma does, what I saw in Verma was that his kind of travel writing is very, very different because what you require as a travel writer, I've read more than a few travel narratives, and I've thought about writing a travel book as well. And then one thing that was common throughout in all these books is that you need to feel really alienated very quickly once you reach your destination, and that supplies the comic energy or the tragic energy that you require. Yeah, you've got to sort of want to get away, get out of the place. Yeah. So a travel writer now going all the way, you could go all the way back to Mark Twain, who wrote a sort of a book about the Germans, and it's all this kind of a complete wholesale acceptance of a stereotype of what the Germans should be like, are like,
Mm.
and Germany kind of Germany, he doesn't feel at home in Germany, you know, and it's because he doesn't feel at home that he's written this particular book, which is a very funny book, you know, about the German language. So there are other examples as well. Jeff Dyer is a great example.
Mhm.
He never feels at home anywhere, and that's why it's great to read his books. But there's another kind of travel writing where the writer, and there aren't many such books, of course, where the writer not just feels at home, but makes that new place another home, you know. And that is what you see in Verma. Verma's writings about Prague, not just Prague, but even when he's in Reykjavik in Iceland, talking to a forgotten writer, the great Haldor Laxness, Nobel laureate, but completely forgotten now. He interviews him. That's another marker of how strange that world was and how different from our world. Two writers, one from Shimla, writing in Hindi, one in Reykjavik, getting together and talking on an equal footing, you know, talking about literature. That was another kind of
Connecting point.
Yeah, that you didn't need any interpreters with you. You were already part of the same tradition, and they could share. An Icelandic writer and a Hindi writer could be a part of the same tradition. That's what Verma, and in fact, a lot of writers from that age tried to do, create a tradition as writers, and include also a very inclusive tradition that created a lot of room for otherness, for the other, you know.
And also a lot of respect for their culture and a desire to explore into that.
Yeah, not just that, but a desire to assimilate that culture, a desire to make it their own. That kind of delusional Borgesian desire. Borges said that, the English, when Borges talked about English writers, he said, "This is my culture." You know, he has a great essay called "The Argentine Tradition and the Argentine Writer," and he says that when a writer succeeds in writing about any subject, that becomes his subject. So when Racine, the French writer, was writing about the Romans, he wasn't thinking about, well, this is not my tradition, I should be writing about the French. Or when Shakespeare was writing about about the Danes in Hamlet, he wasn't thinking about this Danish culture. This is a very recent, this is a new way. This is a very new handicap.
Create a kind of otherness.
Yeah, that if I'm an Indian, I should be writing about Indian things. This is not my culture. That kind of thought never crossed their mind. And to get back to that point about travel writing, Verma was the same writer that he was when he was traveling. And that's the writer, whenever he wrote a novel, or when he wrote a story, when he wrote essays or travel narrative, he was the same kind of writer, the same sensibility. And this is that sensibility. He didn't sort of delineate his own territory, that this is my culture, I'm going to write about this much and not outside that. And when he went outside, he thought of bringing in some aspects of that culture into his own work, and that's what made his travel writing very, very intriguing. Yeah.
There are two relationships or influences I'd like you to talk about on the life of Verma. One is, of course, the Bloomsbury Group, and the other is John Berger.
Yeah.
What kind of influence? You say that, in a sense, both of them, John Berger and Verma, were unlearning Europe.
Yeah.
So this is a very interesting idea. I mean, we are all, great followers of John Berger. Yeah. So this idea was very interesting, looking at how Berger moves from one place to another in order to understand Europe better.
Yeah.
And then you have Verma also, kind of relocating.
Berger, I started reading Berger much before I got around to reading Verma. John Berger was a British-born writer who relocated to Switzerland and then France, died in France a few years ago, and was a great painter as well. Wonderful art critic. He worked across forms, and again a neglected, forgotten figure today. But once he was taken seriously in Britain as well as in Europe. Burma. So first Berger. I mean, when Berger shifted to relocated to Europe around the 50s, the same decade when Verma leaves India for Prague. And Berger had announced very proudly that he had gone to Switzerland when he in the 50s, when he sort of exited England. He said, I did that in order to become a European writer. And I was very struck when I read that sentence. I thought, what is it? Is this some kind of Brexit, Brexit before the fact mentality? Is he not already a European writer when he was living in Britain? And what he meant was he was tired of this kind of, this kind of Anglo-Saxon tendency to look down upon any kind of serious ideas when it came to art. It became a kind of a very, very sort of a counter-snobbish tradition, which is snobbish against the snobs. So, a very anti-ivory tower tradition, the English. And it was pointed out long before Berger by Matthew Arnold. This tendency. And people like Arnold were resisting that. That anything to do with ideas, anything to do with if you announced yourself as a philosopher or someone interested in metaphysics, you'd be laughed out of the room. And that became, and Virginia Woolf was, for instance, even during her lifetime, by writers like Arnold Bennett and Ed G. Wells, those worshippers of the logical, of the empirical. Empiricism is a very British concept. Write about observable reality. Don't dabble too much in dreams. Or mysticism or any kind. So this British culture became. Woolf wrote brilliantly about it in her essays when she and so did Eliot. Dissociation of sensibilities. Eliot writing about the metaphysical poets. He's making a similar point. So these writers are able to. Rebecca West, another great British writer, had a similar kind of a complaint about English culture. They were able to see that as writers themselves, because they're part of a particular culture that sneered upon you if you wanted to do something else. So there was room, according to Berger, in Europe for his kind of writing and for his kind of thinking. And so he wanted to become that's what he meant when he said, I want to become a European writer. And he physically sort of distanced himself from England. Verma did it imaginatively, intellectually. He distances himself from England by going straight to Europe, by of course traveling to Europe, or also as a reader, picking up writers like Walter Benjamin, writers like Proust, writers like Bohumil Hrabal, the great Czech novelist, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, these names, Simone Weil, the great, mystical philosopher. Again, a forgotten figure. Of all these figures are, where are they? I wonder now. So he started reading them, and he said, I'm not going to be another Rudyard Kipling. I'm not going to do what Kipling, and I'm not going to be Mulk Rajani, who's to a larger extent inspired by the British, or I'm not going to be a Neeraj C. Chaudhary in any way, So he finds a new mode of experience, a new kind of register of expression in European letters, in European philosophy, and he brings all that into Hindi, not just through his creative writings, but also through his translations. He and not just by Europe, he extends it to Russia, because there was a time when St. Petersburg and Moscow were very close to Paris and London, at least imaginatively.
He says something very beautiful. He says, rather than have things from English translated, literature from English translated into Hindi, you would directly translate it from the languages so as to capture and, retain its essence.
Yeah, because for too long they depended on the British mediator.
Yes.
That first somebody had to translate something in English, and then we're going to see it in Hindi.
Yes.
And this kind of applies to what you were saying about writers in Goa and other Indian languages. That there is very little interaction I've seen even today between Indian languages without the mediation of English. And that is a big problem. I hope it's kind of addressed.
It has to break down at some point of time. I think now at the university level, there is an attempt to, also bring the regional language in, like Marathi, into university teaching.
Yeah.
And English also, but also Marathi, so that, you also absorb and assimilate the richness of your own culture rather than, being tutored all the time in English and then growing alienated like my generation. We never, would be hit on our knuckles if we tried to speak Konkani, which is our local language, a reified language, no doubt. But they said, you have to learn the language of opportunity, and for that, it is English. So you grew up with that. So automatically, even though I think in Konkani, because I spoke Konkani at home, I write in English because that was the mode that was given to us at that point of time. And many of the kids of my women of my generation, I would say, men and women of my generation, they don't speak Konkani, which is such a handicap for them even to understand the cultural nuances of Konkani, which are very rich in themselves, but unexplored, totally unexplored. Like, till recently, I would be very aghast with literature saying, oh, they had high tea, and English forms of address. Whereas if you go into the villages, the way people address each other is very different. And that was not coming into literature because that was seen as an inferior idiom, and you didn't want to bring it into literature. So you spoke a kind of, Queen's English, which was so false. Okay, let's get on with Verma. I think, thank you all for coming. Those who haven't stayed with us or come have missed a lot, and I don't feel sorry for them, but I will nonetheless reward them with the recording. Okay, now let's come to other things that are closer on home ground now, and were also things that were part of Verma's life. You said that Verma was never a Hindutva proponent. Okay, Verma also talks of a false secularism. You call it soft Hindutva, right? Which is, as you describe it, an oppositional attitude to the left. Okay, which also explains his disillusionment with the left. Okay, and you quote a writer saying that, when a liberal gets bored, he becomes conservative. Okay, could we go on to that a little bit?
Yeah, he was attacked towards the end of his life, during his sort of the Indian phase of his life, if it can be so categorized, that he had become a kind of a Hindu.
He describe himself? Indian Occidentalist.
Yeah, no, I describe him.
Oh, you describe him. Okay.
So so when he came back in the 70s, there is this, I think, in his writings, post-70s writings, one senses a kind of a preoccupation with the idea of Indianness. A lot of German writers during in the 20s and in the early 20th century was similar, especially the Weimar artists and writers were trying to do something similar. They became obsessed with Germanness. The meaning, what does it mean to be a German person? They want to define it. So, and they wanted their paintings and books to represent some of that, some mythology of of the German nation. And I find it very strange when I see it now in the light of what followed Weimar, etc. So I've recently kind of made this connection between the Weimar writers and certain Hindi writers, at least, of the 70s, of that generation, of Verma's generation, who became obsessed similarly with the idea of Indianness, what it means, and that we as writers must define it. It falls upon us to do this, and this kind of took him into an area that his friends, most of them on the left, didn't approve of. So he wrote a very wonderful, according to me, a wonderful piece on the Kumbh Mela. He attended the Kumbh Mela, caused a scandal in the Delhi intellectual circles, and people couldn't believe it. That Verma was at Kumbh for a few days, and came back with a kind of with a wonderful piece which has its moments of
clarity.
Sort of, yeah. I mean, I call it forced spirituality, but he's kind of at least veering towards that, and he's interested in that. One could sense that, and so his friends didn't approve of that essay. He was attacked by people, and then more and more so over the coming years, as Verma started writing these essays with titles like "What It Means to Be an Indian Writer" and "What is the Responsibility of an Indian Writer." So these were the titles, where very sort of serious sounding, almost off-putting titles, and his friends didn't like that. His former friends. So what happened was, I think, some people of the right wing, some political members of right wing parties pounced upon that, saw it as an opportunity because Verma was a leading writer of his time, and they saw a friend in Verma, and they started making overtures. They became almost friends. I think Advani was a friend.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, at least he thought that he was Verma's friend. I don't think Verma took him very seriously. But these guys, these guys started responding to Verma, and Verma also became more and more conservative, as a kind of a posture, as a kind of a stand against the progressive left, because to be a writer in the 70s and 80s in Delhi meant you had to be member of the progressive group of writers or artists. So this was the ruling orthodoxy of the time, and Verma wanted to, I think, this is my reading again, wanted to rebel against that, and so I think he wanted to provoke, and he kept doing that. He kept pushing the line more and more. Some people disagree with this interpretation. They think he was genuinely transforming into this kind of a thinker, a political thinker, and he was genuinely becoming enamored of this right-wing mentality. But yeah, but there's no evidence of that in his published work at all.
I'm looking, as you have looked at, two literary giants in Hindi, Premchand, who said that a writer had to face political challenges, be an agent of social change. That's a big ask, if you ask me today. What about Verma? If you look at his response to the emergency and the writings that he does for Seminar, influenced.
The piece that got him on the list was a sort of
targeted
obscure
list,
and nobody knew what happens to those names on the list. But there's just your name is on the list.
Hey, it's a list.
What it means, nobody. So that was the atmosphere of fear that, and people genuinely got scared. Verma wrote a whole novel about that called Raat Ka Reporter.
Yes.
And it is about such a figure whose name appears on a list. And it kind of in passing touches upon the emergency and political questions, and mostly about it's again about a kind of an existential crisis a man is facing. So it's not a political novel out and out, you know. Now this this is somebody
Yeah.
would take before, yeah. Yeah, you asked me about. Well, I've completely forgotten what you
No,
asked me.
about the writings and seminar of
Yeah, yeah,
Mrs. Gandhi.
his political activism
Yeah, yeah.
as during
How he got on the list essentially.
yeah. So that's, we can connect this to what we were talking about earlier about his um, movement towards the right of the spectrum of the political spectrum. He was again a very sort of an anti-Congress writer because he had witnessed the emergency firsthand. Lots of his friends were thrown into jails, and his mentor, uh, a writer he really looked up to, Vanishwanath Renu. He was he was together with Renu in those marches across Delhi, anti-emergency marches. So Verma, it would be wrong to call him any political writer, although he disagreed with Premchand, what you earlier mentioned.
Yeah.
Premchand's idea was that a writer is never off duty as a political thinker. Should never be. Although Premchand undermined that whole idea through his own writing. In some of his best short stories, for instance, Kafan is a brilliant
Kafan,
example
yes.
where he not just undermines this whole his literary manifesto, but also his political worldview in a sense. You know, it's a strange story. It teaches us nothing, and it gives us no pointers on how to improve society. Nothing. It's one of his strongest stories. You should read if you can read Hindi.
It
Please.
only marks a break because it, you know, it's just the father and the son talking, borrowing money and then
drinking it all away. Yeah.
all away.
So Premchand wrote a manifesto for writers called Sahitya Ka Uddeshya. Now it means the purpose of literature, and he was echoing Matthew Arnold, who wrote a similar kind of an essay. He'd read Matthew Arnold, and he challenged Matthew Arnold's theory of art for art's sake, mentioning that phrase in his Hindi essay. Just another example of how cosmopolitan Hindi writers were at that point. Premchand is in early 20th century. He's writing this, you know, and he's well versed with all this, with the sort of the avant-garde of the European thought. Verma refuses to accept that manifesto. Premchand says a writer, you know, literature is not a mirror reflecting what exists in society. Instead of that, literature should function like a lamp, spreading the light of knowledge and goodness and social equality. So that's what Premchand's credo is. Verma says that a writer has to choose his battles, political battles, and then he says there are certain things that are above politics. There are certain questions that you deal with as a creative writer, and not necessarily as a political thinker, you know. And he does that. He campaigns for his friends during the anti-emergency marches and demonstrations, and then much later, when he's accused of being a Hindutva proponent, he campaigns for M.F. Hussain while Hussain is being hounded out of India. Nobody stood up. Very few, you know, prominent intellectuals.
Which year was this?
I don't remember.
90s, late 90s.
Late 90s, yeah. I think late 90s, yeah. I don't know the exact year. So, and this is very late in Verma's life itself. You know, he was old and ailing at that point. He not just writes in defending his friend Hussain, but in person, he's ready to sort of defend him in person. He presented himself at several places in Delhi with his friends, and his friends would vouch for that from that time. So, and that kind of flies in the face of the Hindutva theory straight away, you know. So he did all that. He was a deeply political writer, but there are other strains in his work that are legitimate and no less sort of legitimate for not being political. You know?
Now we've almost come to the end of the book. We've taken a journey with Vineet. I've really read the book twice and I've enjoyed it. And you have to buy it and, you know, refer it to your college libraries and read it because the language is so lucid. I've never enjoyed a writing on a, I won't call it a biography, but a writing on a writer's life as this one. It's so lucid, it flows, it takes you to different movements which the writer was part of, and at the same time explains everything about, well, tries to explain things about his life and his decisions and his literature. So, like all good things, we have to come to an end. The last chapter in Vineet's book talks about Premchand, I'm sorry, Varman the man, okay? And it talks about the literary landscapes, which are mirror images of the spaces that the author has lived in and inhabited. His fiction, he says, is a distillation of his experiences. And it's a shadow play of his life and dreams, beautifully put across ideas. So you have to buy this book and refer it again to your college library. Thank you, Vineet. It's been
Thanks.
a pleasure sitting with you, and I appreciate the time you've taken off, and lovely to meet your family as well. And let's have some cake and celebrate.
Great,
Thank you.
Thanks.
May I ask a question?
Yes,
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
please.
Like we have written the biography of Mr. Verma. Like everyone has one's own time in writing style and everything. I just want to ask one question from you.
Yeah.
Like from his life, if you are given opportunity to relive, I mean that life. So what